Shut off the past. Let the dead past bury its dead. Shut out the yesterdays which have lighted fools the way to dusty death. The load of tomorrow added to that of yesterday, carried today, makes the strongest falter. Shut off the future as tightly as the past. The future is today. There is no tomorrow. The day of man's salvation is now. Waste of energy, mental distress, nervous worries dog the steps of a man who is anxious about the future. Shut close, then, the great fore and aft bulkheads, and prepare to cultivate the habit of a life of day-tight compartments. Did Dr. Osler mean to say that we should not make any effort to prepare for tomorrow? No, not at all. But he did go on in that address to say that the best possible way to prepare for tomorrow is to concentrate with all your intelligence, all your enthusiasm, on doing today's work superbly today. That's the only possible way you can prepare for the future. Sir William Osler urged the students at Yale to begin the day with Christ's prayer, "Give us this day our daily bread." Remember that the prayer asks only for today's bread. It doesn't complain about the stale bread we had to eat yesterday, and it doesn't say, "Oh God, it has been pretty dry out in the wheat belts lately, and we may have another drought, and then how will I get my bread to eat next fall?" Or, "Suppose I lose my job, oh God, how could I get bread then?" No, this prayer teaches us to ask for today's bread only. Today's bread is the only kind of bread you can possibly eat. Years ago, a penniless philosopher was wandering through stony country where the people had a hard time making a living. One day a crowd gathered about him on a hill, and he gave what is probably the most quoted speech ever delivered anywhere at any time. This speech contains 26 words that have gone ringing down across the centuries. "Take, therefore, no thought for the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof." Many men have rejected those words of Jesus, "Take no thought for the morrow." They have rejected those words as a counsel of perfection, as a bit of mysticism. "I must take thought for the morrow," they say. "I must take out insurance to protect my family. I must lay aside money for my old age. I must plan and prepare to get ahead." Right, of course you must. The truth is that those words of Jesus, translated over 300 years ago, don't mean today what they meant during the reign of King James. 300 years ago, the word thought frequently meant anxiety. Modern versions of the Bible quote Jesus more accurately as saying, "Have no anxiety for the tomorrow." By all means, take thought for tomorrow, yes, careful thought, and planning and preparation, but have no anxiety. During the Second World War, our military leaders planned for the morrow, but they could not afford to have any anxiety. "I have supplied the best men with the best equipment we have," said Admiral Ernest J. King, who directed the United States Navy, "and have given them what seems to be the wisest mission. That is all I can do." Whether in war or peace, good thinking deals with causes and effects, and leads to logical, constructive planning. Bad thinking frequently leads to tension and nervous breakdown. I had the privilege of interviewing Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, publisher from 1935 to 1961 of one of the most famous newspapers in the world, the New York Times. Mr. Sulzberger told me that when the Second World War flamed across Europe, he was so stunned, so worried about the future, that he found it almost impossible to sleep. He would frequently get out of bed in the middle of the night, take some canvas and tubes of paint, look in the mirror, and try to paint a portrait of himself. He didn't know anything about painting, but he painted anyway, to get his mind off his worries. Mr. Sulzberger told me that he was never able to banish his worries and find peace until he had adopted as his motto 5 words from a church hymn: "One step enough for me." Lead, kindly light, keep thou my feet. I do not ask to see the distant scene, one step enough for me. At about the same time, a young man in uniform somewhere in Europe was learning the same lesson. His name was Ted Benjamino of Baltimore, Maryland, and he had worried himself into a first-class case of combat fatigue. In April 1945, wrote Ted Benjamino, I had worried until I had developed what doctors called a spasmodic transverse colon, a condition that produced intense pain. If the war hadn't ended when it did, I'm sure I would have had a complete physical breakdown. I was utterly exhausted. I was a Graves Registration non-commissioned officer for the 94th Infantry Division. My work was to help set up and maintain records of all men killed in action, missing in action, and hospitalized. I also had to help disinter the bodies of both Allied and enemy soldiers who had been killed and hastily buried in shallow graves during the pitch of battle. I had to gather up the personal effects of these men and see that they were sent back to parents or closest relatives who would prize these personal effects so much. I was constantly worried for fear we might be making embarrassing and serious mistakes. I was worried about whether or not I would come through all this. I was worried about whether I would live to hold my only child in my arms, a son of 16 months whom I had never seen. I was so worried and exhausted that I lost 34 pounds. I was so frantic that I was almost out of my mind. I looked at my hands. They were hardly more than skin and bones. I was terrified at the thought of going home a physical wreck. I broke down and sobbed like a child. I was so shaken that tears welled up every time I was alone. There was one period soon after the Battle of the Bulge started that I wept so often that I almost gave up hope of ever being a normal human being again. I ended up in an Army dispensary. An Army doctor gave me some advice which has completely changed my life. After giving me a thorough physical examination, he informed me that my troubles were mental. Ted, he said, I want you to think of your life as an hourglass. You know there are thousands of grains of sand in the top of the hourglass, and they all pass slowly and evenly through the narrow neck in the middle. Nothing you or I could do would make more than one grain of sand pass through this narrow neck without impairing the hourglass. You and I and everyone else are like this hourglass. When we start in the morning, there are hundreds of tasks which we feel that we must accomplish that day. But if we do not take them one at a time and let them pass through the day slowly and evenly, as do the grains of sand passing through the narrow neck of the hourglass, then we're bound to break our own physical or mental structure. I've practiced that philosophy ever since that memorable day that an Army doctor gave it to me. One grain of sand at a time, one task at a time. That advice saved me physically and mentally during the war, and it has also helped me in my present position as Public Relations and Advertising Director for the Ad Crafters Printing and Offset Company, Incorporated. I found the same problem arising in business that had arisen during the war. A score of things had to be done at once, and there was little time to do them. We were low in stocks. We had new forms to handle, new stock arrangements, changes of address, opening and closing offices, and so on. Instead of getting taut and nervous, I remembered what the doctor had told me, one grain of sand at a time, one task at a time. By repeating those words to myself over and over, I accomplished my tasks in a more efficient manner, and I did my work without the confused, jumbled feeling that had almost wrecked me on the battlefield. One of the most appalling comments on our present way of life is that at one time, half of all the beds in our hospitals were reserved for patients with nervous and mental troubles, patients who had collapsed under the crushing burden of accumulated yesterdays and fearful tomorrows. Yet a vast majority of those people could have avoided those hospitals, could have led happy, useful lives, if they had only heeded the words of Jesus. Have no anxiety about the morrow. Or the words of Sir William Osler. Live in day-tight compartments. You and I are standing this very second at the meeting place of two eternities, the vast past that has endured forever, and the future that is plunging on to the last syllable of recorded time. We can't possibly live in either of those eternities, no, not even for one split second. but by trying to do so, we can wreck both our bodies and our minds. So let's be content to live the only time we can possibly live, from now until bedtime. Anyone can carry his burden, however hard, until nightfall, wrote Robert Louis Stevenson. Anyone can do his work, however hard, for one day. Anyone can live sweetly, patiently, lovingly, purely, till the sun goes down. And this is all that life really means. Yes, that is all that life requires of us. But Mrs. E.K. Shields of Saginaw, Michigan, was driven to despair, even to the brink of suicide, before she learned to live just till bedtime. In 1937, I lost my husband, Mrs. Shields said as she told me her story. I was very depressed and almost penniless. I wrote my former employer, Mr. Leon Roach of the Roach Fowler Company of Kansas City, and got my old job back. I had formerly made my living selling world books to rural and town school boards. I had sold my car 2 years previously when my husband became ill, but I managed to scrape together enough money to put a down payment on a used car and started out to sell books again. I had thought that getting back on the road would help relieve my depression, but driving alone and eating alone was almost more than I could take. Some of the territory was not very productive, and I found it hard to make those car payments, small as they were. In the spring of 1938, I was working out of Versailles, Missouri. The schools were poor, the roads bad, and I was so lonely and discouraged that at one time I even considered suicide. It seemed that success was impossible. I had nothing to live for. I dreaded getting up each morning and facing life. I was afraid of everything. Afraid I could not meet the car payments, afraid I could not pay my room rent, afraid I would not have enough to eat. I was afraid my health was failing, and I had no money for a doctor. All that kept me from suicide were the thoughts that my sister would be deeply grieved, and that I didn't have enough money to pay my funeral expenses. Then one day I read an article that lifted me out of my despondence and gave me the courage to go on living. I shall never cease to be grateful for one inspiring sentence in that article. It said, "Every day is a new life to a wise man." I typed that sentence out and pasted it on the windshield of my car, where I saw it every minute I was driving. I found it wasn't so hard to live only one day at a time. I learned to forget the yesterdays and not to think of the tomorrows. Each morning I said to myself, "Today is a new life." I have succeeded in overcoming my fear of loneliness, my fear of want. I am happy and fairly successful now, and have a lot of enthusiasm and love for life. I know now that I shall never again be afraid, regardless of what life hands me. I know now that I won't have to fear the future. I know now that I can live one day at a time, and that every day is a new life to a wise man. Who do you suppose wrote this verse? Happy the man, and happy he alone, he who can call today his own, he who, secure within, can say, "Tomorrow do thy worst, for I have lived today." Those words sound modern, don't they? Yet they were written 30 years before Christ was born by the Roman poet Horace. One of the most tragic things I know about human nature is that all of us tend to put off living. We're all dreaming of some magical rose garden over the horizon instead of enjoying the roses that are blooming outside our windows today. Why are we such fools, such tragic fools? How strange it is, our little procession of life, wrote Stephen Leacock. The child says, "When I am a big boy," but what is that? The big boy says, "When I grow up," and then grown up